Yeah. Yeah.
So again, ladies and gentlemen, these are your cameras for introduction.
Wait, is that in the script? I don't remember seeing that. And if it's there, but why? But
The 2018 Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series, brought to you from the studios of Georgia Public Broadcasting. The Democratic race for the 6th Congressional District.
good morning. I'm Bill Nygett, the host of Political Rewind on Georgia Public Broadcasting Radio. Welcome to the Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series, originating from the studios of Georgia Public Broadcasting in Atlanta. This is the debate among the Democratic candidates for Congressional District 6. District 6 includes parts of East Cobb County, North Fulton, and North DeKalb counties. Let's meet the candidates. We'll introduce them in alphabetical order. Kevin Abel is the founder of Abel Solutions, a technology consulting company. Bobby Kaple is a former news anchor with CBS 46. Steven Knight Griffin is a former policy coordinator at the CDC and the National Center on Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities. And Lucy McBath is the national spokesperson and faith and outreach leader for two organizations, Everytown for Gun Safety and Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. Now let's meet our panelists. Jeremy Redmond is a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Michelle Wright is a news anchor with WSB Radio, and Ellie Yu is a reporter at WABE 90.1 FM. All right, with all the introductions out of the way, let's get started. If you want to know information about the debate rules, go ahead and visit the Atlanta Press Club website, atlantapressclub.org. We're going to start the debate with a section in which each candidate will be asked two questions by the panel. Jeremy Redmond, you get your first question to Steven Knight Griffin.
Hello, Mr. Griffin. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Tom Steyer was recently in town with his Need to Impeach campaign, and that's an effort to impeach the president. Where do you stand on this issue and why?
I'm glad you asked that question. It's an important one, and it's one that our country needs to talk about in a serious way. Now, the Mueller investigation has not concluded at this point, but I think it's important for us to keep an open mind and to generally consider things from the perspective of what if. I went there primarily to hear out what he had to say, to hear out his case for making the impeachment scenario come to pass, and also to make sure that I understood the issue in a full fashion in as much as I can within the context of knowing both what we do not know and knowing what we do know. I think it's important for us as prospective candidates to have a full understanding of the issues and for us to approach them in a forthright and straightforward manner. And so I wanted to hear out someone who has paid a lot of attention to what's going on, and I wanted to pay attention to someone who has put a lot of thought and a lot of effort into what they're trying to do. I keep an open mind, and I encourage other people to do the same.
Quick follow-up from me. Are any of you in this group already advocating for the president to be impeached if you should win election? Show of hands if you are advocating for an impeachment of the president. None of you has gone there at this point. Okay. Ellie, you have a question for Lucy McBath.
Ms. McBath, you had originally decided to run for a state government seat and switched to running for Congress. Why did you make that change?
Well, in doing work on gun violence prevention and around the country, I began to recognize that there were a lot of issues outside of gun violence that my citizens, my neighbors in my district were concerned about. And so I was running for District 30, House District 37, but in light of everything that I saw happening with Parkland, I just decided that enough was enough. I spent a lot of time the last 5 years around the country talking to our federal legislators, talking to our state legislators, trying to bring some common sense solutions into our existing gun culture. I just thought when I saw those children stand up, I thought enough is enough. Someone needs to help support them fighting for their lives. And watching television, watching President Trump with our legislators, I kept saying, I know the right questions to ask. I should be there. I know how to hold them accountable. And that's why I decided to switch for this race.
Thank you very much, Ms. McBath. Michelle, right, it's your turn to ask Kevin Abel a question.
Mr. Abel, as we know, this district gained a lot of publicity last year in the run there. And it's a bit of an uphill battle for a Democrat. Tell me why you want to run, why you want to represent this district.
Thank you, Michelle. I came to this country at the age of 14, and I've lived here for 40 years, and I've lived the American dream. I've raised my family for 26 years here in the district. I've created a business. I've created good-paying jobs in Alpharetta. I've been deeply involved in the civic and community life of Atlanta. And I've lived the American dream, but I fear that this dream is not available for so many Americans anymore. I fear that Congress is broken. The big issues of our day are not being addressed. I am going to go to Congress and work to find bipartisan resolutions to the key issues facing our country. I am committed to solutions for America, and I'm committed to making sure that we protect our American dream for future generations.
I want to ask you a quick follow-up, because you're the one candidate on the panel who has the most dramatic commercial, essentially being very, very critical of President Trump. Can a candidate who is as anti-Trump as you've portrayed yourself to be win this district in a general election?
I think it's safe to say that all of the candidates, in fact, all Democrats in our district, are viscerally anti-Trump. But in addition to that, we have a significant segment of the independent and Republican electorate in this district who themselves are extremely unhappy with the direction that President Trump and Karen Handel, by extension, are taking the Republican Party. I believe it is absolutely time to call out President Trump and to call out Karen Handel for the things they are doing and not doing for our country, and these are votes that can be won in November.
Thank you for that. Jeremy Redmond, your question for Bobby Kaple.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Just yesterday, Congresswoman Karen Handel sent out an email to her supporters warning that the Democrats are seeking to retake the House, and warning that if they do, Nancy Pelosi could return as the House Speaker. If you were elected, if you win this primary and you defeat Karen Handel in the general election, what would be your position on returning the gavel to Nancy Pelosi?
Well, I think it is time for new leadership in Washington on both sides of the aisle. And I think there's a reason we have seen so many people just on this stage alone and across the country, first-time candidates stepping up and running for office. It's not because they like the status quo. 125,000 people came out to vote right here in Georgia's 6th District just about this time last year in that special election, and they voted against Karen Handel. And again, I think this has a lot to do with the fact that people are not content with where this country is headed right now, and I believe it is time for new leadership.
Ellie? I'm sorry. Yeah, no, that's right. Ellie, it is your turn to ask Steven Knight Griffin a question. I apologize.
Mr. Griffin, do you support a single-payer health care system? And if so, how would you propose a system like that to be financially feasible?
Thank you for the question. Right now, from the proposals that I've seen, I think a single-payer system is, while it's a laudable goal, it's also very expensive. Some of the proposals that I've seen amount to about $3 trillion, and I'm open to seeing various plans to pay for that. But in the interim, I think it's really important for us as Democrats to focus on what is pragmatically possible in the future. So what I propose in lieu of a single-payer system is actually a robust public option. It's something that was intended to be part of the ACA from the very beginning. It's something that would dramatically reduce premiums, would increase coverage options for people, and much more than simply being about access, which is something that we hear a lot, but it's a Republican talking point. It would provide legitimate coverage to people across the country and make sure that regardless of where they live and regardless of their status, they would have an option, and make sure that they have, in turn, the care that they need in order to live healthy, quality lives.
Let me follow up real quick. If you should win election in the fall, but the House doesn't become Democratic, if the Democrats don't take control, how much leverage do you imagine you'd have to promote your health care plan?
That's a great question as well, and one that I've thought about quite a bit. So if we do not manage to flip the House and the Senate, which I think is far from a foregone conclusion at this point, I think that this could be argued from a financial and fiscal responsibility standpoint. And from what I've seen from the votes that have taken place, the ACA isn't going anywhere. If they had had the ability to repeal it, they would have done so already. If they had had an alternative plan, they would have done it already.
Okay, thank you for that. Michelle, you have a question for Lucy McBath.
Ms. McBath, part of this district, as we know, it made history last year with as the most expensive House race. And so I ask this because looking at some of the research that I've found, raising money, you're kind of on the tail end of that. How do you hope to gain publicity and get your name out there so people know what you stand for in light of that?
Well, as we know that I'm the late bloomer to this race, I did jump in late, but I do know in the work that I've been doing with Everytown for Gun Safety and Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, I do know that there are other organizations, gun violence prevention organizations, also Emily's List, that are investing in me. And I welcome that investment because I know that they believe in me. They believe in my ability to make an impact in Washington. And there are other organizations as well that are willing to, so to speak, place their bets on me in going to Washington and doing what's right for the citizens of the 6th Congressional District.
Before we go on to another round of questions, I want to follow up to a couple of things that were said earlier, if I may. First of all, Ms. Kaple, you already said you would not vote for Nancy Pelosi as Speaker if Democrats take control. Are all of you committed? Which of you on this panel has already decided you would in fact support Ms. Pelosi for Speaker? None of you?
Well, what I would say is that I don't think that we need to be discounting the good work that Nancy Pelosi has done on behalf of the Democratic Party. But of course, I don't think any of us on this panel could make those wise decisions without the resources and the information that we need. And we can only do that once we get to Washington.
Anybody else want to have a quick response on that? Real quick.
So I think all of us up here recognize the incredible work that Leader Pelosi has done from her perch in Washington, and what's more than that, just the incredible status she has as a fundraiser for the party and making sure that we move meaningful legislation through. What I think that we need, regardless of that, is fresh blood and new perspectives. And I've actually proposed several people that I think would be excellent alternatives, like Sherry Bustos.
Do you want to get a quick shot at that, Mr. Abel?
No, not right now. Thank you.
Okay. Jeremy, we're back to you with a question for Kevin Abel.
I want to ask about Pelosi. I'm curious to hear your position on that. But
okay, I'm going to get it anyway.
If you'd like to address it.
Sure.
But I do want to hear your position on something that recently happened where we had a large caravan of immigrants arrive on our southwest border seeking asylum from deprivation and gun violence, poverty, drug violence as well. How should the U.S. government respond to them?
Yeah, Jeremy, thanks for all of your reporting on the immigrant issue and the refugee issue. We're a nation of immigrants who come to this country to work hard and achieve the American dream. You know, when President Trump declared his candidacy, he came down that escalator and denigrated Mexico and Mexicans. He stirs up hate and dredges up fear in the dark part of our human soul. This is not just a policy issue. This is a value that is core and critical to who we are as Americans. Right now, amassed at the border in Tijuana, right there in California, are migrants coming from Central America seeking asylum. Yesterday, 8 of them were allowed into our country, 7 children and 1 adult. We have a responsibility as a country, just as the Europeans have taken in Syrians who are migrating and fearing for their lives, so we have a responsibility to accept asylees who come to our country with a need and because of a fear of persecution from the countries they come from.
Thank you for that, Mr. Abel. Ellie, you get the last question in this round, and it's to Bobby Kaple.
After many debates last summer, the Affordable Care Act remains in effect, but a lot of people say that it's not working for them. Insurance premiums are rising. A major insurer has pulled out of the marketplace in Metro Atlanta. How do you propose to stabilize the marketplace, and how do you plan to do so in this current climate in Congress?
Thank you for the question. First of all, this is really the reason for my candidacy. I was a news anchor here in Atlanta for several years, and I quit my job at the peak of my career with 2 young children because I care so deeply about this specific issue. My kids were born prematurely at just over 3 pounds each. I've got boy-girl twins right down the street here at Piedmont Hospital. They spent 17 days in the NICU, racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in bills, the kind of bills that can bankrupt a family. And one of the problems with this current Congress is last summer they tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act again and again and again. And what we found was that people actually didn't like seeing their health care coverage stripped away. And I think my focus will be, if I get to Congress, is ensuring that folks with pre-existing conditions never have to choose between their health and bankruptcy, ensuring that children like mine who had an extended stay in the neonatal intensive care unit never have to face lifetime caps in a health insurance market that we are in America. Yes, go ahead, Bill.
Thank you for your answer, but then again, I ask you the same question.
Yeah.
If you don't have a Democratic House, or a Democratic Senate, how do you possibly accomplish any of this?
Well, and I appreciate the premise of the question, but I reject it. I think we are going to have a Democratic House in the fall, and I think we're going to be coming from a position of strength as Democrats, and we're going to have the opportunity to negotiate directly with this White House to cement some of the things that people like about the Affordable Care Act. You mentioned specifically insurers pulling out of the marketplace. You're talking about Blue Cross Blue Shield right here in Georgia. That is a direct result of this president saying publicly he wanted to tank this law. It has nothing to do with the Affordable Care Act itself. And in fact, it's why premiums have gone up 20%. We've got to stabilize the marketplace, and then we'll have better health care.
All right, thank you for that answer. So, okay, that's our first round of questions for everybody. In the second round, we change things up a bit. Candidates are going to have an opportunity to ask a question of an opponent of his or her choice. The candidates get 30 seconds to ask the question, and there's 60 seconds for a response and 30 seconds for the rebuttal. By a random selection by our team, Kevin Abel, you are going to get the first opportunity to ask a question of one of your opponents.
Thanks. And so my question is for Bobby. And, you know, we know that Nancy Pelosi is going to run to be Speaker of the House when we win the House next year. At 4 candidate forums, an AJC question, and I believe the way I heard your answer today, you're not answering that question directly. This is going to be a big issue in November. Frankly, it's already a big issue now. I'm not suggesting there's a right answer or a wrong answer to the question. I'm just suggesting that the constituents in the 6th District deserve a right answer.
Yeah, no, I totally appreciate the question. And what I've been pretty clear on this from the whole time I've said is that I will vote for the speaker who best represents this district, and I believe it's time for new leadership.
I understand, Bobby. And again, with all due respect, I think that this is a politician's answer. I think the people of the 6th District and Americans in general are tired with political speak. I think they want directness, they want candor from their politicians, and I think this is a question that could be answered now and should be for the 6th District.
I'm not sure how much more direct I can be.
Okay.
All right, Lucy McBath, it's your turn. You get to ask one of your opponents a question.
Thank you so much. I'd like to, if I may, direct my question to Mr. Griffin. Mr. Griffin, and having worked in gun violence prevention around the country for the last several years, I understand that the NRA leadership has actually been very successful in defunding any ability for the CDC to be able to do research on the implications of gun violence on American citizens. My question to you is, do you support that kind of research and why?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked that question. Coming from CDC, it's incumbent upon me, and as the only person here with public policy experience, especially in the healthcare sphere, I really think that we do need to properly fund the study of gun violence, and we should do so without preconceptions. It's really important for us to have facts, to have evidence, in order for us to properly approach the question of gun violence in this country. And so while the Dickey Amendment has largely been annulled by the omnibus spending bill, which was recently passed, we still need to actually pass that funding. And so to that end, I would go to Congress and I would support funding for CDC gun violence research.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on then. You do have 30 seconds to respond if you want.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. As having done this work in the among communities all over the nation, I see the implications every single day. And having lost my own son to gun violence, I know how important that the CDC be able to have this kind of research and data just shows the implications of gun violence and the devastation that it causes around the United States.
All right, thank you very much. Bobby Kaple, your turn.
At this time last year, the eyes of the nation were focused right here on Georgia's 6th Congressional District for the special election that was taking place. My question is for Ms. McBath. Voting records indicate that you did not vote in either special election in April or June. I would just love to hear why that was.
Absolutely. I have been a Georgia resident since 1990, and my son was born and raised in Georgia. In 2016, as I was traveling on behalf of the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton, for personal family reasons, I voted in Tennessee. And then in 2017, I switched it back. Now, as I was traveling on behalf of the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton, I heard some horrible things that were said about me from the Republican Party, that I was a pawn for Hillary Clinton and that I was pimping my child. And it's very hard rhetoric to hear from the Republican Party. However, for anyone in this party to challenge my commitment to the Democratic Party, I think it's very painful, and I really think that we can do better than that.
Thank you very much for your response.
You want to take your 30 seconds to respond to
Thank you
that?
for answering the question. Thank you.
All right, Steven Knight Griffin, you get the last question.
Thank you, sir. So this question is directed to Bobby. Recently, 538, which is a statistical analysis group online, has shown us and has proven that the media has been taking a beating in terms of its credibility and in terms of just general perception. So my question is this. Given the fact that Democrats, by and large, are increasing in favorability, but Republicans have dropped to 20% favorability ratings, how do you plan to address that, given the context that we will need moderate Republican voters to win the election in the 6th?
I'm sorry, I guess I'm confused as the question.
Okay. So given the unpopularity of the media and the people who deliver it, how do you plan to win moderate Republican votes?
Fair point. All right. So, look, I think one of the things about the current climate that we're in right now with this administration is they are bullying and beating up on just about anybody they can get their hands on, especially folks in the media. And I will tell you this, you'd be surprised at how popular local news personalities and newscasters and reporters are, because we are actually the ones uncovering stories in our communities. One of the great things about having been a journalist here in Atlanta is I've gotten the opportunity to spend time not just in my bubble where I live, but I've been able to meet folks from all walks of life and tell their stories and listen to their stories. Listening is something we haven't seen a lot of out of this current representative. She won't hold a town hall with anybody that didn't vote for her, and I think that's a travesty in an American democracy.
All right, thank you. Before we move to the next round, Ms. McBath, if I may, I think our viewers do deserve a little clarity. You said you voted in Tennessee for personal reasons. I think it's fair for us to ask, what does that mean?
Well, my husband is a permanent resident of Tennessee.
Okay.
And there were some considerations that we were making, and we made those decisions, and we switched it back.
I guess I'm asking, what does that mean, there were considerations you were making? I do think that's a question that people have a right to ask.
Well, I mean, my husband is a permanent resident of Tennessee, and, you know, we were dealing with some personal issues.
Okay.
His father was not healthy at the time. They run their personal family farm. So those are all reasons that we were considering at the time.
Thank you. I'm really not trying to dig into your personal life, but I want to make sure our viewers get some sense of that decision. All right. So if you're just joining us, this is a debate between the Democratic candidates for Georgia's 6th Congressional District. We're going to go to our final round. And now in this round, we bring the panelists back in. They'll each get to ask a question of the candidate of her or his choice until we run out of time. And again, I'm going to continue to exercise an occasional privilege as moderator to ask a follow-up question of the candidates. And I'll also decide when a rebuttal to the question is appropriate. Michelle, you get the first question.
Ms. McBath, I'd like to point this to you based on the response that you just gave and based on last year's Democratic candidate and his, how shall we say, where he lived, basically. And so just clarify, do you live in the 6th District?
Yes, ma'am. I live in the 6th District. Jordan went to Marietta High. I have neighbors that I've been living amongst there since 2008. So, yes, I actually physically live in the district.
Okay. You want to try one, Jeremy?
Yeah, Mr. Kaple. So John Ossoff narrowly lost to Karen Handel in the last election. What did he do wrong? How will you campaign differently if you advance past the primary?
Well, I don't think this is an opportunity to discuss what was done wrong. I think he did a lot right in laying the groundwork for all four of us to actually have an opportunity to win this seat. This seat would not be in play were it not for his improbable campaign in last summer's special elections. I think for me personally, we're running on a bold message. If you've seen our TV ads, we're not shying away from anything. It has to do with our personal life experience. I think it's important that we have somebody that is not only willing to listen to the voters here in Georgia's 6th District, but that when needed, will stand up to President Donald Trump and his apprentice, Representative Karen Handel.
Let me follow up, because I asked Kevin Abel this question, and you opened the door for it, Mr. Kaple. How important is it going to be for a Democratic candidate in the general election to take on Donald Trump in a confrontational way? There are many people who criticize John Ossoff for not being tough enough in terms of dealing with Mr. Trump. How big an issue is Donald Trump going to be in the fall campaign?
Well, while we are all running against Karen Handel, Donald Trump is the man who is looming over this entire country's electoral process in November. We've seen it in the special elections since right here in the 6th District with wins by Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania, Doug Jones in Alabama, big wins in Virginia by Democrats as well. I will not shy away from this president and shy away from calling him out when he's done something wrong. And I also won't shy away from the fact that Representative Karen Handel has attached herself at the hip to Donald Trump. She was up in Pennsylvania with him on stage at the Connor Lamb rally.
Okay.
She doesn't represent Pennsylvania. The only reason she's there is because she's with the president.
Thanks. Ellie?
Speaking about the president, Mr. Abel, is there an issue you'd be willing to work with the president on?
I'd be willing to work with the president on just about any issue if he approached us, the Democrats in Congress, with some reasonable-minded approaches to things like health care or immigration or the budget or climate change. So yes, absolutely. I am all about the fact that we need more rational-minded congressmen and women who are willing to come together, work across the aisle to find sustainable solutions that Americans deserve. So I would absolutely welcome the president and members from the Republican Party approaching Democrats and finding solutions to these issues. I believe healthcare is the most critical issue looming over our country, hanging over our head as we enter the next decades. It is imperative that we find sustainable healthcare policy for our country.
Ellie, before we move on, you satisfied with what you heard there, or do you want to ask a follow-up?
Is there an issue right now you would be willing to work with the president?
Well, I would love for President Trump to come forward with healthcare policy that he'd be willing to negotiate. I firmly believe that the Affordable Care Act is the right framework for policy for healthcare in this country, but I acknowledge that there are many areas where it needs to be addressed and shored up. And so healthcare is absolutely the #1 priority, and I would love to negotiate with him on that.
You're up, Michelle.
All right, Mr. Knight, I'd like to address this question to you, and it's pretty basic in its premise. A lot of people don't even realize there's an election going on right now. Right. And so, especially in the 6th District, there was such a blow up last year. And I mean, everywhere you turned around, there was TV ads and all of this stuff. How do you anticipate getting the word out that you are the one that should run against Karen Handel?
Absolutely. And I appreciate that question. So I think that we have shown in the previous election that it's about much more than just how much money you have in your war chest. It's about candidate quality. It's about having a message, and it's about standing for something rather than simply standing against someone. So to answer your question directly, I plan to go door to door in as much as possible within the next 4 weeks to meet people, to have real conversations with people, because it is in those real conversations that we find the opportunity not just to win votes, but to change minds and win hearts. And we saw this with Connor Lamb, we saw it with Doug Jones, and I expect that it will be a successful approach going forward.
All right, you okay with that one?
I'm okay with that.
All right, Jeremy, your turn.
Ms. McBath, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
You're a very well-known gun control advocate, and you've focused more attention on this issue by joining this race. Your family story is extremely compelling. I'm interested to hear where you are on other issues, though. For example, the opioid epidemic. It's extremely deadly. It's killing more people than car crashes at this point. What are your solutions for addressing this epidemic?
Well, definitely, we know that is definitely a scourge on America. I think that being able to allocate some more funding towards putting, what do I want to say, eradicating this kind of opioid, eradicating this crisis. You know, we're spending a lot of money. We're giving huge giveaways to multinational corporations and to the rich. I believe that funneling some of that money and those resources towards this crisis is what the American people deserve. And that would be my decision in Washington, to make sure that we're spending the money and the resources where we need to, allocating them and doing what's best for the American people.
I think that's a really important question right now, so I'd love to get a quick answer from everybody else on the panel. Why don't you, you can each have about 20, 30 seconds to answer it.
Absolutely. So working with CDC as I did, I recognize the importance of addressing this crisis. I think we need to act locally. We need to equip first responders with Narcan, with naloxone, so that they can immediately save lives. More broadly than that, we need to fund rehabilitation and pharmaceutically assisted rehabilitation programs. And we also need to go and understand and underlie the base root of the problem. We need to go into these communities and understand what is causing the hopelessness and despair and that is fueling this crisis.
You know, a lot of times this gets looked at as an issue in just poor communities. And that's just not the case. This affects everybody. We had a young woman in our office last month who lost her best friend to this exact issue. And one of the things when you dig deep into the Affordable Care Act, you see is that there's actually funding for not only counseling, but for help in prevention and treatment for the opioid crisis. Now, it's not enough, obviously, because we still have a massive problem. But Representative Handel actually wants to take that funding away. So we need to not only be looking at protecting what's currently on the books, but we need to look at where we can expand and help folks.
So I'm in complete agreement with the comments of my peers here, but there's one other issue, and that is to go to the source. The pharmaceutical companies, the drug companies, have capitalized on these drugs and making them so readily available. We need to hold them accountable for much better controls over the access of it.
So you support the municipalities around the country who have filed lawsuits against opioid manufacturers for false advertising, marketing, and that you would like to see that expanded, perhaps nationwide?
Yes, I believe that the federal government has a role in holding these companies accountable, and the ridiculous fine that was slapped on the pharmaceutical companies last year is just not sufficient.
Yeah, should we point out that a couple of Georgia communities, including Savannah, have been involved in that suit. Do you want to ask another question? Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Michelle. We'll go back the other way.
All right, very good. Mr. Kaple, let me address this question to you.
Sure.
We all know that we're in a predominantly red state here. Yes. And a lot of what we've talked about, there's been a lot of gun violence recently, all of that. Most of those that are running as Republicans are touting, we've got to keep the Second Amendment rights. Yeah. Tell me where you stand on that and what that looks like for people who are Second Amendment rights advocates.
I think this is actually an area of agreement, not just on this stage, but in the Democratic Party right now, and also with common sense people who are Republicans as well. I think there are 4 things that can be done immediately to help stem the gun violence issues in our country. You got to start with universal background checks. We got to start by closing the gun show loopholes. Remember when they were going to ban bump stocks after the Las Vegas shootings? That never happened. That should happen. The fact that someone on the terror watch list at this time can still go purchase an automatic rifle or an AR-15 is absurd. There's also an issue that doesn't get quite as much discussion, but I think is equally important when it comes to gun violence, and that's domestic violence. There was a lot of good work done in the Congress back in the 90s on this issue, and there's still more work to be done there. Specifically, there's a couple loopholes I'd like to see closed having to do with misdemeanor stalking and also dating violence. Folks who are in those positions should not be allowed to get firearms. They are predictive of future violence.
Okay. Anybody else want a quick shot at that? I mean, pardon me, I did not mean the pun there. I think we all, I think you all have, Bobby Kaple probably said it, and we know certainly, Ms. McBath, that you've been an advocate for more gun control. Ellie, you want to ask another question?
Sure. Georgia, in many ways, has been leading the country in bipartisan criminal justice reform. Mr. Abel, what would you like to see happen at the federal level?
Right. Excuse me. We have a criminal justice system in this country that is hopelessly biased, towards young black males. Young black males are incarcerated at a rate of 5 to 6 times more than their white peers, and this is just unacceptable in our country. We need reform at the federal level. We need to take away minimum sentencing guidelines. We need to stop the privatization of prisons. And I believe it's time that we decriminalized marijuana and, prevented throwing people in prison for possession.
Anybody else want to take a shot at that while we're on the subject?
Yeah. So I think that sentencing reform is going to be critically important. And unfortunately, we've seen steps backwards from that direction since Jeff Sessions has taken up his perch in the administration. What I would welcome seeing is the continuation of those bipartisan efforts at a federal level as well as state levels so that we can fundamentally address this problem and make sure that we have these conversations and make sure that we address the social justice issues involved with this, making sure that young black men are not incarcerated at rates above and beyond the rest of the population, making sure that marijuana is decriminalized both in a medicinal and a recreational perspective, and that the tax money is used to improve communities all over the country.
As a woman of color, I absolutely have had my fair share of understanding the underlying issues that cause these problems. But once again, I would support decriminalization of marijuana. I would also support the reducing the numbers of individuals that are being massively incarcerated, and also making sure that we are not privatizing our prisons. Having great exposure in this area and dealing with people all around the country, I think that these are some of the most common sense ways that we can change this culture.
We'll give you a few seconds on this one too, Mr.
Quick,
Kaple.
this isn't criminal justice reform is an issue that used to be just a one-party issue, and now people of common sense on both sides of the aisle agree that this is something that needs to take place. Everybody here has hit on the two big ones, which is ensuring that we are not institutionalizing a whole class of citizens from the beginning. And secondly, ensuring that we're not profiting off the back of institutionalizing those citizens.
Okay. Jeremy, your turn.
Back to Ms. McBath. Yes. So the Republicans are campaigning hard to keep control of the House by focusing on their tax cut plan, saying that they're putting more money in taxpayers' pockets. If you win your party's nomination and you get into a contest with Karen Handel, how are you going to respond to that message?
Well, I absolutely oppose the Trump Handel tax scam. I think that it's fiscally irresponsible, and I think that it adds $2 trillion worth of to our national debt. Once again, as I've said earlier, that I believe that we're giving these massive giveaways to multinational corporations and to the rich. What I really think that I really think that this really hurts our standing with the American people. I think that they're losing confidence in our president and not in the administration. And what I'd like to be able to do is I want to be able to give tax relief to middle-income families and small businesses. Heavens knows that they are the backbone of not only of America, but of the 6th Congressional District. And I think that doing such is really going to give a lot of tax relief to people that need to be able to keep food on the table and pay their bills every single day.
You're up, Michelle.
All right, Mr. Abel, let me ask you this question, and it's, again, kind of basic in its questioning, but I'm eager to hear your answer. What made you think, I want to be the representative for the 6th District and I can do it, and how am I then going to work with those across the aisle?
Right. So it goes back to an earlier question you asked me, and frankly, in the wake of the John Ossoff, Karen Handel election last June, I took a serious look at the situation. I wrote a letter to my friends at the AJC, and I said, what does the Democratic Party need in a candidate who can beat Karen Handel in November 2018? And I answered my own question. I said, we need a candidate who lives in the district for 26 years, perhaps. He's raised his family. Someone who's created jobs. Someone who is of this district, been deeply involved in the community and civic life of Atlanta. I believe that I, having lived in this district, having befriended most of my friends, Republicans in Alpharetta, talked with them about politics for 20 years, found that there's more that unites us than what divides us. I believe that the majority of Americans play between the 30-yard lines and that there's room for compromise and that they're looking for a candidate like me to go to Congress.
All right, I want to ask a quick question. I'm looking for very brief answers to this. It's twofold. You've been elected. You are now serving in the next Congress of the United States. Each of you, please tell me, what's the #1 committee you want to serve on and why?
I want to be on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and this is an area where I can deal with healthcare issues, which is a fundamental issue for our country and one that I'm most passionate about, and environmental issues, because I believe that climate change is real and we need to bring a real conversation about climate change to Congress.
Mr. Kaple?
Yeah, I'm echoing Mr. Abel here. Energy and commerce is where the action is when it comes to reforming our healthcare system and ensuring that millions of Americans are continuing to keep their coverage.
House Energy and Commerce is an incredibly important position, but I would favor the Appropriations Committee for the simple reason that if we cannot fund our priorities, we can't get anything done. Thank you.
Ms. McBath?
Most definitely working on gun violence prevention. I believe that every individual in this country should be able to live without the fear of being gunned down unnecessarily, and putting common sense solutions in our existing gun laws ensures that everyone can live in this country that way.
Jeremy, I'm told it's your turn.
Mr. Kaple. So we have a situation where Robert Mueller is still continuing with his investigation. Should Congress pass legislation to shield Robert Mueller from being removed by President Donald Trump, and why?
I'll make this real quick. Yes, because it's important that presidents aren't investigating themselves.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
I believe that we should support legislation that prevents Special Counsel Mueller from being taken out of that position. He needs to be able to continue the investigation and definitely finish his job. I think that it instills confidence in the American people when that will be done.
Yeah, absolutely. We should protect Robert Mueller and the ongoing investigation. This is one of the most critical, fundamental issues facing our democracy right now as we speak.
I think that we absolutely should pass legislation given the current situation, but we also need to be very cautious in doing so because it is the insinuation of one branch of government into another, and this kind of thing can set a bad precedent. And if it were used in a way where the president was not being legitimately investigated, it could be problematic. So I would say that, yes, in this current situation, it's appropriate, but broadly, we need to have conversations before making this permanent.
All right. Ellie?
Mr. Griffin, Congress for the last year or so, there hasn't been a resolution on Daca, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. How would you, given the current climate, try to resolve this issue?
Absolutely. And I think that Daca is wonderful material for a larger bipartisan compromise on the entirety of the immigration issue. What I would like to see come out of the Daca situation is a pathway to citizenship for all of those children who came here through no fault of their own. This isn't just a matter of policy and reality. This is fact, and it's a matter of humanity and dignity. And these children and who came here through no fault of their own, it would be inhumane in the extreme, and it would be contrary to our values for us to do anything else. So I would like to see it be part of a larger compromise on a wide variety of issues.
You want to follow up?
What would this immigration reform bill need to include? Yeah.
Absolutely. So in order to win the Republican votes necessary to ensure passage, I think that we would need to meaningfully compromise on border security. That doesn't mean I support a wall. I think a wall is really poor policy. It wouldn't work. It's silly. But I think that we do need to provide the technology, the tools, and the manpower necessary to secure our southwestern border and to make sure that not only from an immigration perspective, but also from a national security perspective, that we are safe in that sense.
So let me do a follow-up. DACA has a great deal of bipartisan support. We all know that. And I can only assume that everyone on this panel, unless you tell me otherwise, supports a continuation of DACA. So let me ask the broader question, and let me start with you, Mr. Kaple. What else should be included in an immigration reform package? Should there be a path to citizenship for undocumented residents of the United States? Should there be some safety provided to all of them without regard to whether they're deferred action on childhood arrival?
Sure. Let's start with DACA, and then we'll move down the line here. I think specifically on DACA, the president's decision was not only cruel, but it was reckless. And to leave millions of children who have come here through no fault of their own in the balance and not knowing whether they're going to be deported to a country that they've never known.
Okay, but what is the broader
important.
package?
Now,
what should it include?
Right. Let's go to the next level on this. You look at this president's constant discussion about building a wall on the southern border. I agree with Mr. Griffin in that this kind of policy is just not smart policy, and this goes to the heart of this presidency and my issue with it, which is that this president does not make policy based on listening to experts around him who have been in the field of study and actually know what they're talking about. Instead, he gets his campaign policy from chance at his campaign rallies.
Should there be a path to citizenship?
I think it's important that we look at all of these things. There was bipartisan support for that very thing under several different presidents.
Okay.
I don't see any reason why this Congress can't take a look at the immigration issue we face here and start dealing with it.
Thank you. Ms. McBath?
I will support a Clean Dream Act. I will ensure that there's a path to citizenship for these children, for these individuals. I will do whatever I can to make sure that they are not deported. And when I am in Congress, I will work on a policy agenda for comprehensive immigration reform. I think it's necessary. I think it's long overdue. And I do not support any measures by this president to deliberately discriminate against any individual.
Thank you, Mr. Abel.
Bill, it's very rare that I use the word easy in the context of policy, but there's an easy answer to this question. In 2013, the Senate passed a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform bill. It didn't make it to the House, but by a vote of 68 to 32, the Senate, reflecting the interests of the United States of America, had a comprehensive bipartisan bill that had 11 million undocumented immigrants without felony convictions having a pathway to citizenship, including all the Daca beneficiaries, as well as additional border protection and law enforcement, as well as changes to the visa program. This is a bill whose structure I would absolutely support so we could move forward on this issue.
So there are roughly 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, and not all of them passing through the southwestern border, some simply overstaying visas. I think it's incredibly important that we address this holistically, but we also do it from a standpoint where we don't want to encourage further undocumented immigration. So yes, I do support a pathway to citizenship for the people who are already here because they have already enmeshed themselves into the fabric of their communities. They become part of their economies, and it would be just impractical as well as inhumane to remove them at this point. But it should be a one-time amnesty.
All right, thank you all for answering that question. Michelle?
I'd like to switch gears just a little bit and talk about education and schools. And basically, I want to get your view on where the government, where the feds stand versus the states when it comes to schooling. Our current education secretary does favor charter schools. What's your take on that? Do you think it's something that the federal government should be handling, or should it be left to states? Should it be cooperative? And I'd like to hear from everybody.
Who do you want to start with?
You know what? I'll just go down the line. Let's start with Ms. McBath.
Most definitely. When I was a single mother, and I was, when I was a single mother, and I was for many years, it was very evident to me very quickly that the neighborhood public school that Jordan was not going to be able to educate him in the way that he needed. And so I was forced to homeschool him. The No Child Left Behind law policy did not work for me. And in that time, I began to understand that, yes, we have to have standards, but I didn't believe that our children should continue to be education according to standardized tests. Now, I know that our American citizens are paying a lot of federal tax dollars into their education. I do not believe in the defunding of our children's education by by Betsy DeVos and by President Trump. I think that all the federal tax dollars that are going into our public schools needs to remain within our public schools.
Our public school system in this country is under attack, and we see this from multiple different perspectives. In addition to privatizing the funding via charter schools and things like that, we also see strikes taking place across the country, teachers demanding better pay. And I think that the federal government has a role in resolving all of these. We need to provide additional funding for public schools, not diverted to private schools, but actual funding to improve teacher pay, to make sure that these public schools have the funding they need to achieve proper educational outcomes. That doesn't mean teaching to a test. That means teaching practical life skills, things that will serve these children well in their lives and prepare them for a job or for a career in the 21st century. Thank you.
Kaple?
I am not a fan of the policies that Betsy DeVos is putting forward at the federal or the state level. And I think it's so important, as a graduate of public high school myself, to make sure that we are protecting our public schools. That is where the good work is being done. I come from generations of teachers. My mother was a teacher. My grandmother was a teacher before her. they deserve our support, and the students deserve our support that are in public schools. I also think that this goes beyond simply elementary and K through 12. I think this extends to the student loan crisis that we are now facing in this country. My wife, who's here this morning, is a graduate at the University of Georgia, and the only reason she was able to attend was because of the Hope Scholarship. And we need to be making sure that college is affordable, not just for folks who want to go to four-year universities, but also that vocational training is available. There are jobs available to people out there. They just need to be trained for them.
You know, I'm the beneficiary of an amazing public school education and public college education, as are my three children in high schools here in Atlanta and recipients of the Hope Scholarship. I believe that Betsy DeVos is to education what Scott Pruitt is to the environment and Jeff Sessions is to justice. We must not allow for funding designated for public schools to be diverted to private schools. We absolutely need to stay true to our mission as Americans that every child must have access to a quality education.
So I want to follow up very quickly because we're running out of time. Should I assume that in addition to charter schools, which she's talking less about charter schools, more about school choice, should I assume that, well, let me ask it more openly. What about school choice, Mr. Griffin? Should citizens have more opportunity to choose a school for their children?
I think people shouldn't need to choose different schools. I think that we should have a standard that we strive for, not in terms of legislatively enforcing it, but making sure that the schools have the resources that they need to deliver a quality education, regardless of where you are in this country. For some people, choice is simply not an option. You look at rural areas where they don't have a lot of options as far as education goes. So it's a little bit of a shell game.
All right, we got to move very quickly.
Yes, I don't think, once again, it should be a matter of having to make a choice. That's the reason why I founded Champion in the Making Legacy Foundation, for that very reason, giving the resources to children that otherwise might fall through the cracks.
Thank you. Mr. Abel?
You know, parents should be allowed to choose the schools they send their kids to, but they can't take federal and state money along with them. The money needs to stay with the local schools.
Mr. Kaple?
I think one of the issues with school choice as a slogan is it's a nice slogan for Betsy DeVos and folks who back her agenda. Unfortunately, it's setting up a false choice for people and setting up a second tier of schools. And for those who can't afford to choose the better schools, you get left with bad public schools. And that's why we need to continue funding public schools.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you all very much for your forthright manner in answering the questions that the panel has asked today. That's all the time we have for questions. Now we're going to give each candidate 60 seconds to give a closing statement. Bobby Kaple, you, I'm told, get the first closing.
All right. Thank you. We're now on the campaign trail 7 days a week. We're 3 weeks away from Election Day. Early voting has begun. And one of the things I made a promise to my family when I decided to do this was to ensure that I would put my kids to sleep every single night, or at least 4 or 5 times a week. And when I do, I read a book to each of my twins. They each get to pick out one, and my daughter always picks the same one. It's called You're Here for a Reason. And she always hangs on one specific page where she says, even the smallest of things that you do blossom and multiply far beyond you. We're raising our kids in a household that knows that no act of kindness is too small and that our actions have consequences. Last summer, when they were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Rebecca and I would stay up until midnight every time when they would do one of those votes, and we'd hold our breath. And millions of more Americans were calling their legislator to ensure that they didn't strip away their health coverage. And when you're calling for your life or your twins' lives, you can no longer sit in a newsroom and simply report on this. Actions have consequences, and I ask for your vote on May 22nd.
Thank you very much. Ms. McBath?
When my son was killed unnecessarily due to gun violence, I had to decide for myself, how was I going to live out his legacy in the rest of my life? And I've made a commitment to not only Americans around the country in terms of keeping them safe, but I want to make a commitment to my neighbors in the 6th Congressional District. I will work in Washington to make sure that things that they're concerned about, making a livable wage, being able to put food on the table, being able to educate their children so that they're able to compete compete globally, making sure that women's health care and their rights are protected. Those are the same problems that people have all around this state, and I would find it an honor and a privilege to work on behalf of their needs, because that's the same thing that I was teaching my son Jordan to do.
Thank you very much, Ms. McBath. Steven Knight Griffin.
This district deserves someone who understands policy well enough that they don't need to memorize talking points, that they don't need to approach things from a sideswiping manner. This district deserves a fighter, someone who has gone toe-to-toe with Zika virus, developmental disabilities, and birth defects. This district deserves someone like me, someone who has grown up in the district, watched it change and grow. And this district deserves someone who is going to fight for an America that fights for them. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that very concise closing. Mr. Abel, you have the final closing statement.
Thank you very much. Look, I've lived in this district for 26 years, raising my family, growing my business, leading in the community. One of the banes of my existence here for 26 years in Georgia in this district is living under Newt Gingrich, Johnny Isakson, Tom Price, and with Georgia 400. Look, who would have ever thought a Democrat could win in this district? But last year, John Ossoff got so close, within 9,000 votes. But we learned a lot last year in the election. We learned that it's going to take more than a fresh, young, telegenic face and a lot of money to win in this district. We need someone who can win those 9,000 independent votes. I am that candidate who will beat Karen Handel in the fall. I will go to Washington, D.C., take on the dysfunction in Congress. I will fight the bigotry of the Trump administration, and I will work to protect the American dream for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your participation in this debate. That is all the time we have today. We want to remind you all out there, the primary elections are going to be held on Tuesday, May 22nd, but early voting has already begun. So get out and vote whenever you do it between now and May 22nd or on that day. Our thanks to the candidates and to our panel of journalists. I also want to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging today's debate. For more information about the Press Club and all of the debates that they're going to host during this primary season, visit atlantapressclub.org. This debate will be archived on the Georgia Public Broadcasting website and on the Atlanta Press Club website. You can go to gpb.org to see our debate coverage. I'm Bill Nigut. Thanks for joining us for the Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series.